If you ask a person who doesn't play games how games tell stories, they'll probably imagine something like this.
How was your day?
What?
Huh?
Got none of that.
Oh, sorry. I'm sorry. How was your day?
This is called a cutscene. It's essentially video games mimicking film language to tell a story like a movie would. However, this isn't the only way games can tell stories. The only non-optional kind of narrative in games is gameplay-based narrative, which is what we'll talk about today. Broadly speaking, gameplay tells a story through actions. If you do something in a game, it communicates the fact that action occurred, even if no dialogue or cutscene confirms it. Unless your character dies, in which case the game pretends it never happened, which it signals by undoing the death. In The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild, your gameplay loop looks something like this. You see something, set out towards it, find some monsters or a puzzle, fight the monsters or solve the puzzle to get a reward, and then look for another journey. Now on a macro level, it kind of looks like no story happened here. No characters had changes of motivation, no new information was revealed, character's arc didn't move forward, and no other big events occurred. When you zoom in, you find a different view on things. For starters, moment-to-moment storytelling matters. If a book spends the time between one plot point and another describing the scenery, that's very different than spending that time describing characters arguing in circles, even though neither directly moves the story forward. In games, rather than big, plot-heavy scenes being the bread and butter of the story, it's the repetitive loop of gameplay. In this case, hitting monsters and enemies tells a very basic story. Something like, the hero fought the monsters by throwing a bomb and then defeating them with his sword. There's an opportunity for variation here in terms of how the player wins the fight and what kinds of enemies they fight. One time you might knock a big enemy off a bridge, and another you might fight a huge wave of small enemies, skillfully dodging and counterattacking. On a higher level, the gameplay loop tells a story through contrasting states of play. You start by choosing something to do, either for the larger story or just because it's interesting. Then you travel, see what's there, make a plan, and execute it. That's a little story right there. When you string these stories together, simple stories like the hero fought some enemies in a field becomes the hero traveled across the field, fighting enemies along the way, and arrived at his destination. If this string of gameplay loops is sandwiched by cutscenes or dialogue, then the story becomes I talked to this person, went and solved their problem, then returned. This of course leads to a limitation of this kind of storytelling. If your gameplay loop is centered around hitting enemies with your sword, then the enemy has to include things that you want to hit with your sword. One of the most obvious examples of this is fighting games. Since the mechanics only allow for 1v1 fights, every story segment must end in a fight. The mystery, dialogue, emotions, character arcs, none of it can be done through gameplay unless you can make it meaningful through a fight. Most games simply don't bother, having some basic dialogue followed by a fight. But personally, I think the most jarring problem is with open world games. Most open world games feature one way of interacting: violence. They make a beautiful world populated with diverse people and animals and give you nothing except a gun. That's more like a shooting gallery than a world. Some of the most expressive games manage to interweave their gameplay into a meaningful part of their story, regardless of whether the gameplay is violent or not. If you're going to make a game about shooting people, that's fine, but stop insisting you're telling a deep, emotional narrative about friendship or whatever, then asking me to beat the shit out of people. The mechanic of this video is pressing the subscribe button, and this video's story was a cutscene stopping you from doing that.